Welcome back. In this lesson, I want to introduce the term service models, specifically cloud service models. If you've ever heard or seen the term something as a service or XaaS, then this is generally a cloud service model, and that's what I want to cover in this lesson. Before I start, there are a few terms that I'd like to introduce which will make the rest of this lesson make more sense, as well as being helpful throughout the course. If you already know these, then that's fine, it will just be a refresher. But if these are new, then it's important to make sure you understand all of these concepts, because they're things that underpin a lot of what makes the cloud special. Now, when you deploy an application anywhere, it uses what's known as an infrastructure stack. An infrastructure stack is a collection of things which that application needs, all stacked onto each other. Starting at the bottom, everything runs inside a facility, which is a building with power, with aircon, with physical security. Everything uses infrastructure, so storage and networking. An application generally requires one or more physical servers. These servers run virtualization, which allows them to be carved up into virtual machines. These virtual machines run operating systems. They could potentially run containers. An example of this is Docker. And don't worry if you don't know what these are, I'll be covering them later in the course. Every application is written in a language such as Python, JavaScript, C, C++, C#, and all of these have an environment that they need to run in, and this is called a runtime environment. An application needs data to work on, which it creates or consumes. And then at the very top is the application itself. Now, all of this together is an infrastructure stack or an application stack. If you use Netflix or Office 365 or Slack or Google or your online bank or this very training site, it has parts in each of these tiers. Even the application that you're using right now to watch this training is running on an operating system, which is running itself on a laptop, a PC, or a tablet, which is just hardware. The hardware uses infrastructure, your internet connection, and this runs in facilities, so your house or a coffee shop. With any implementation of this stack, there are parts of the stack that you manage, and there are parts of the stack which are managed by the vendor. So if you're working in a coffee shop, they'll have specific people to manage the building and the internet connection, and that's probably not you. But it's more likely that you are responsible for your laptop and the operating system running on top of it. Now, this is true for any system. Some parts you manage, some parts somebody else manages. You don't manage any part of Netflix, for example. Netflix as an entity manage everything end to end. But if you do work in IT, then maybe you do manage all of that IT infrastructure stack or some parts of it. The last term that I want to introduce is what's known as the unit of consumption. It's what you pay for and it's what you consume. It's the part of the system where from that point upwards in the infrastructure stack, you are responsible for management. For example, if you procure a virtual server, then your unit of consumption is the virtual machine. A virtual machine is just an operating system and an allocation of resources. So your unit of consumption is the operating system. In AWS, if you create a virtual machine known as an instance, then you consume the operating system. If you use Netflix though, then you consume the service and that's it. You have no involvement in anything else. The unit of consumption is what makes each service model different. So let's take a look. With an on-premises system, so that's one which is running in a building that your business owns, your business has to buy all parts of the stack. It has to manage them all, pay for the upkeep and running costs of all of them. And it has to manage the staff costs and risks associated with every single part of that stack. Now, because it owns and controls everything, while it is expensive and it does carry some risks, it's also very flexible. In theory, you can create systems which are tailor-made for your business. Now, before cloud computing became as popular as it is now, it was possible to use something called data center hosting. Now, this is similar to on-premises architectures, but when you use data center hosting, you placed your equipment inside a building which is owned and managed by a vendor. This meant that the facilities were owned and controlled by that vendor. You as a business consumed space in that facility. Your unit of consumption was rack space. If you rented 3 racks from a data center provider, they provided the building, the security, the power, the air conditioning, and the staffing to ensure the service you paid for was provided. All of the service models we use today are just evolutions of this type of model, where more and more parts of the stack are handed off to a vendor. Now, the costs change, the risks that are involved change, and the amount of flexibility you have change, but it's all the same infrastructure stack, just with different parts being controlled by different entities. So let's look at this further. The first cloud service model that I want to talk about is Infrastructure as a Service, or IaaS. With this model, the provider manages the facilities, the storage and networking, the physical server and the virtualization, and you consume the operating system. Remember, a virtual machine is just an operating system with a certain amount of resources assigned. It means that you still have to manage the operating system and anything above the operating system, so any containers, the runtime, the data, and your applications. So why use IaaS as a service model? With IaaS, you generally pay a per second, per minute, or per hour fee for the virtual machine. You pay that fee when you use that virtual machine, and you don't pay when you don't use it. The costs associated with managing a building, procuring and maintaining infrastructure and hardware, and installing and maintaining a virtualization layer are huge, and they're all managed by the vendor. The vendor needs to purchase things in advance, pay licenses, pay staff to keep things running, and manage the risks of data loss, hardware failure, and a wealth of other things. Using IaaS means that you can ignore all of those and let the vendor manage them. IaaS is one of the most popular cloud service models. Now, you do lose a little bit of flexibility because you can only consume the virtual machine sizes and capabilities that the provider allows, but there is a substantial cost reduction because of that. In AWS, a product called Elastic Compute Cloud, or EC2, uses the IaaS service model. So in summary, IaaS is a great compromise. You do lose a little bit in terms of flexibility, but there are substantial cost and risk reductions. Okay, so let's move on. Another popular service model is Platform as a Service, or PaaS. Now, this service model is aimed more at developers who have an application they just want to run and not worry about any of the infrastructure. With PaaS, your unit of consumption is the runtime or the runtime environment. So if you run a Python application, you pay for a Python runtime environment. You give the vendor some data and your application, and you put it inside this runtime environment, and that's it. You manage your application and its data, and you consume the runtime environment, which effectively means that the provider manages everything else: containers, operating system, virtualization, servers, infrastructure, and facilities. Now, an example of this is that I manage a Slack community for certification and IT training. Slack doesn't handle public invites very well, and so I wanted to host an application which invites people to this Slack when they enter their email address. So I used a product called Heroku, and with Heroku I create an account, I pick a runtime, I upload my code, and then it's hosted as an application. Now, this runtime environment has certain resources and it costs me a monthly amount, but in exchange for that monthly amount, I don't have to worry about anything else. Now, I have to pay, I'll lose some flexibility versus self-hosting, but I have so much less costs and risks versus self-hosting because I don't have to manage anything below the runtime. Now, there are PaaS products in AWS which I'll be showing you throughout the course, but in the real world, PaaS is mainly used for developers. Now, let's review one final service model before we finish this lesson. The final service model is Software as a Service, or SaaS. And with SaaS, you consume the application. You have no exposure to anything else. You pay a monthly fee for consuming the application. You get it as a service. Now, examples of SaaS products include Netflix, Dropbox, Office 365, Flickr, even Google Mail. Businesses consume SaaS products because they are standard known services. Email is email. One email service is much like another, and so a business can save significant infrastructure costs by consuming their email service as a SaaS solution. They don't have much control of exactly how the email service is configured, but there are almost no risks or additional costs associated with procuring a SaaS service. IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS are examples of cloud service models. Now, there are others, such as function as a service, known as FaaS, container as a service, database as a service, or DBaaS, and there are many more. As I go through the course, I'll point out when an AWS product is IaaS, PaaS, or SaaS, together with any of the other models. For this lesson, the important points to understand are that the infrastructure stack exists in every service and application that you use, that part of the stack is managed by you, that part of the stack is managed by the provider, and for every model, there is part of the stack which you consume, your unit of consumption. That's the part that you pay for, and generally the part that delineates between where the vendor manages and where you manage. Now again, I know this has been a fairly theory-heavy lesson, but I promise you it will be invaluable as you go through the course. Thanks for listening. Go ahead, complete this video, and when you're ready, join me in the next.